Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Appalachia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the year 1872, the mountains were still a raw, unyielding frontier. Appalachia stretched endlessly, ridges upon ridges of pine and oak, cut by mist and silence. Roads were not roads, but wagon scars, winding through valleys where families lived and died without ever seeing a town hall. Somewhere along the border between Virginia and Tennessee, a cluster of cabins known as Hollow Creek Settlement sat at the end of a trail so forgotten it did not appear on most maps. That spring, 3 travelers from Knox County, 2 brothers named Caleb and Jonah Ray, and their cousin Elias Finn, set out toward the settlement. They were traders by profession, selling mule harnesses, nails, and cloth. Their plan was to reach Hollow Creek, spend 2 nights, then head east to barter with a man known only as Henry Maddox. Locals described Maddox as a recluse who bought in bulk and paid in silence. The Appalachian region, as documented decades later in historical studies of the Great Appalachian Wilderness, was known for its isolation and suspicion toward outsiders. According to one surviving letter from a circuit minister, Reverend D.W. Coleman, "No man enters those hills without leaving some piece of himself behind." By late May, the Ray brothers had reached Stark's Crossing, the last recorded stop before Hollow Creek. A blacksmith there, Luther Hale, signed their ledger on the 21st. He later testified that they were in good spirits, said they'd camp at the Maddox place by sunset. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. Weeks passed. Their families sent riders north and south. In mid-June, Sheriff August Whitley of Hawkins County filed a missing persons notice. His written report, preserved in county archives, mentions that Mr. Henry Maddox, a man of unknown age residing near Hollow Creek, failed to present himself for questioning. The report ends abruptly, the ink running as if written in haste. When deputies finally rode up to the Maddox property, they found the gates open and the house empty. The fireplace was still warm. A single boot, half burned, was found beside it. Behind the cabin, a shallow pit had been dug but not filled. Within it lay scraps of cloth and a rusted bit of harness metal, consistent with the trader's wares. From that moment, Hollow Creek was never the same. The name Henry Maddox became a whisper, a curse passed between hunters and drifters. Children were told not to follow strangers down the valley path, lest Maddox call them for company. Yet, in all the confusion, no bodies were ever found. When Sheriff Whitley returned from the Maddox property, he carried with him a notebook bound in rough hide. It had been found under a loose floorboard in the cabin, pages water-stained, the ink half-faded. Written across the first page, in an uneven hand, were the words, "Property of H. Maddox, Hollow Creek, 1870. The rest of the entries were erratic. Some described weather conditions, others were inventories of traded goods. 3 bolts of cotton, 2 mules, unfit, 4 guests, departed. One page, however, contained only a single line. "The ridge keeps what it's given." Investigators had little to work with. Hollow Creek in those days had no formal law, no consistent mail, and no church registry. The closest thing to record-keeping came from traveling ministers or local merchants. Most of what was known about Maddox came from word of mouth, and those who spoke did so with caution. According to one elderly farmer, Mrs. Ida Lohman, who lived 2 miles downriver, Maddox had once been a school teacher in Wise County, Virginia. "Quiet man," she recalled in a statement dated August 3, 1872, but not right in the eyes. He'd stare at the trees as if waiting for them to speak. Another farmer insisted Maddox had served as a medic during the Civil War, tending to wounded men in the highland passes before retreating deeper into the hills. By midsummer, newspapers in Knoxville and Bristol printed brief notes under "Missing in the Mountains." They mentioned the trader's disappearance, but gave only one name: Henry Maddox. Most readers likely assumed it was another wandering tale of debt and theft, common in that era. But a few journalists took interest. One, Elias Trenton, from the Knoxville Sentinel, rode out to the settlement in August. His article, now preserved in the State Archive, described the place vividly. "No birds sang in Hollow Creek when I arrived. The air hung at a stillness, as if the mountains themselves were listening." The Maddox homestead was stripped bare, as though the forest had reclaimed it overnight. Trenton claimed to have met a preacher named Coleman, the same who had written earlier about the dangers of the Appalachian isolation. Coleman told him Maddox was seen again. He crossed the ridge near Roan Gap after dusk, carrying what looked like a child's satchel. The report was never verified. Within a month, Trenton fell ill from fever and was taken back east, leaving his notes incomplete. The sheriff's men made another search in September, finding nothing but animal bones and the remnants of campfires. By that autumn, the community began to vanish piece by piece. The Lomans moved west. A family named Beckett abandoned their mill, claiming they heard tapping beneath the earth at night. The creek that once provided water to the settlement ran shallow and red for several days. Iron deposits, they said. When winter came, the cabin of Henry Maddox collapsed under snow. No one rebuilt it. By the thaw of 1873, Hollow Creek was officially declared abandoned. Sheriff Whitley, citing the ongoing unease among remaining residents, closed his investigation. But not everyone agreed that the matter was settled. A year later, a federal surveyor named Thomas Wainwright was sent to chart mineral prospects in the Appalachians, part of a wider post-war study of the region's resources, an initiative often mentioned in later accounts of the great Appalachian wilderness. Wainwright's field notes, preserved in a Washington archive, contain a passing mention of Hollow Creek. Local folk avoid the ridge north of the settlement. They claim to hear hammering after dark. No structures remain but the outline of a cabin and a pit roughly 7 feet wide. I advise future travelers to camp elsewhere. He also recorded that the soil near the pit was disturbed recently, less than a month before his visit. There were no footprints, only claw marks, as if something dragged itself out, not in. The description stirred attention decades later, but at the time it barely reached print. By the mid-1870s, rail expansion and coal interests had drawn eyes to larger matters. Hollow Creek faded from conversation, surviving mostly in the cautionary tales of loggers and trappers. Still, one figure kept the name alive: Dr. Alistair Grimm, a physician and amateur historian, who in 1881 began collecting oral testimonies about lost settlements in Appalachia. His compiled volume, Notes from the Ridge, included a chapter titled The Maddox Affair. Grimm interviewed the now-aged Reverend Coleman, who claimed that before disappearing, Henry Maddox confessed a kind of burden. He said to me, "Reverend, the mountain doesn't bury, it remembers." Grimm dismissed any talk of haunting, but he noted how consistently witnesses described a low, rhythmic sound echoing near the creek on windless nights. He suggested it could be groundwater shifting through hollow shale. Yet his final note reads, "If geological, it is curiously deliberate." Sometime after Grimm's visit, a hunter named Ephraim Tate reported finding a rusted knife along the ridge, its handle carved with the initials H.M. He turned it into the county office, though no record of it survives beyond a single entry in the 1882 inventory book. Item 14, iron blade, marked origin uncertain. By 1885, even that entry was crossed out with red ink. The story might have ended there had not a team of road surveyors, years later in 1890, uncovered what appeared to be a small foundation near the same ridge. Among the stones lay fragments of glass and bone, none human according to the local coroner. Yet the site's alignment matched the position of the Maddox property exactly as drawn on old tax maps. And so the name resurfaced, whispered again among miners and travelers. They said Henry Maddox was seen walking the ridgeline at dusk, coat torn, face hidden under a brim, forever searching for what the mountain refused to return. When the 1890 discovery reached the nearby towns of Rogersville and Kingsport, curiosity returned to the matter briefly. A few journalists sent inquiries, but by then the local courthouse fire of 1889 had already destroyed many of the older records. Sheriff Whitley had long passed away, and most of his papers, those that mentioned Maddox, Hollow Creek, or the Ray brothers, were reduced to ash. One surviving letter, however, found in a private collection decades later, carried Whitley's signature. It was addressed to a state marshal and dated January 4, 1874. The letter read, "Maddox is not gone. His traps are seen, his steps found near Wolf Run. The ridge keeps him as it keeps the others." Whether Whitley meant that literally or not remains uncertain. In the spring of 1891, an old trapper named Hiram Booth brought a story to the Bristol Gazette. He claimed to have met a man fitting Maddox's description, gaunt, soft-spoken, wearing a gray coat torn across the shoulder, who bought food from him near the Powell River crossing. Booth described how the man refused to step into the sunlight, saying only, "I've been under long enough." The editor published the story under the headline, "Ghost or Fugitive? The Maddox Sightings Resume." Most readers took it as Appalachian folklore, but Booth's sworn affidavit still sits in the county's miscellany file. During this same period, Dr. Alistair Grimm, already known for his earlier investigations, wrote again about Hollow Creek in his final volume, Appalachian Testimonies. He compared the Maddox case to other disappearances recorded in mountain towns, pointing out that the pattern always involved travelers, strangers, and vanished trails. He cited local geography from the Appalachian Mountains Survey, the same one documented later in the Great Appalachian Wilderness Studies, as partial explanation. Dense woods, limestone sinkhole, less and sudden floods could easily erase human traces. Yet Grimm ended his discussion with an uncharacteristic sentence. "Logic can account for the dead, not the silenced." That line appeared underlined twice in his handwritten drafts. By the late 1890s, Hollow Creek was marked on no maps, though hunters and timbermen still used the name when referring to the valley north of the old trade path. A railroad briefly considered routing through the area, but withdrew after engineers reported unstable ground and unexplained subsidence. Folklore adapted to fill the gaps. Families along the valley began telling their children that the wind at dusk was Maddox counting his guests. It became a warning not to wander alone. Some older women even hung pieces of iron above their doors. An old mountain superstition said to keep the ridge from calling. Whether Henry Maddox truly survived those years or became one more ghost folded into the mist, no one could say. But even by 1900, travelers reported an uncanny quiet where Hollow Creek once stood, as though the land itself were listening, waiting for someone to speak the wrong name aloud. In 1901, a small team from the Appalachian Geological Commission passed through the Hollow Creek region while studying mineral veins. Their senior surveyor, Edwin Latimer, kept meticulous journals later archived at the University of North Carolina. His entry for September 17th reads, Camped near an abandoned homestead west of the ridge, chimney intact, stones blackened. Locals identify it as the Maddox place. Soil unusually warm beneath surface, no explanation. Latimer noted that his men refused to stay past sunset, citing the low tone of moving air that did not move the trees. Though a man of science, he admitted that the valley's silence creates a weight on the nerves. Among his papers was a crude sketch of the remaining foundation, almost identical to Wainwright's drawing from 1873. Both maps mark the same clearing, bordered by two dying oaks. On the reverse, someone, likely a field assistant, had written in pencil, "It's still breathing." By this time, the story of Henry Maddox had crossed into the realm of mountain folklore. Traveling preachers referenced him in sermons about sin and isolation. Old-timers claimed the ridge took those who lied. But in the few surviving official reports, Maddox was always treated as human, missing, perhaps guilty of murder, but never supernatural. A particularly revealing document surfaced in 1905 when a trunk belonging to the late Reverend Coleman was opened by his grandson. Inside were several letters exchanged between Coleman and a man he addressed as H.M. The handwriting matches that of the Maddox notebook found decades earlier. One of the letters reads, "I am not alone here, Reverend. The ground has memory. Each time it rains, I hear their names again." Coleman's reply, though brittle with age, offers a tone of compassion rather than fear. "You must leave the ridge, Henry. No man can atone where the dead are buried." The letters end there. That same year, hunters discovered fragments of a wagon axle embedded in a dry creek bed several miles east of the Maddox site. The design and metal matched mid-century trade wagons, the kind the Ray brothers had used. No human remains were found nearby. The sheriff at the time, Calvin Bragg, sent the fragments to Nashville for analysis. His final note simply reads, "Returned to origin. Appalachia." As years passed, the surrounding counties grew busier. Rail lines pushed through, and small mining towns emerged, but Hollow Creek remained untouched. Maps labeled the area unfit for habitation. Travelers passing through often remarked that compasses faltered near the ridge, the needle wavering west even on clear days. Some said the earth there was heavy with ore. Others whispered it was something older, something that remembered. By 1908, interest in the Hollow Creek case flickered back to life when a young folklorist from Charleston, Miss Eleanor Dray, began gathering stories from isolated Appalachian communities. Her goal was to catalog vanishing oral histories before modernization erased them. When she reached Hawkins County, she heard the name Maddox whispered before she ever mentioned her intent. Dray's notes, later published in Echoes from the Ridge, Folk Narratives of the Southern Appalachians, describe her uneasy visit. The air grew colder as I approached what the locals called the Maddox Hollow. Not one bird sang. An old woman named Ruth Beckett warned me to turn back, saying the ground breathes at night. She said a man once lived there who talked to the soil until it answered. Dray stayed only a few hours, but her report included one curious detail: a rusted hook nailed to the remains of a doorframe with a small scrap of blue fabric still caught on it. She brought it to town, thinking it might once have been part of a child's garment. When she returned 2 days later with a photographer, the hook and wood had vanished entirely. Her companion, Thomas Wells, later wrote privately that the clearing itself seemed rearranged, as if some invisible hand had turned the earth over. He refused to revisit the site. Dray's work referenced the great Appalachian wilderness studies that had mapped the region years earlier, noting how its isolation preserved both landscape and superstition. She emphasized that Hollow Creek was less a place and more a silence, one that consumed detail and resisted memory. Back in Charleston, she presented her findings to a local historical society. Among the listeners was Professor Gideon Marr, a geologist who dismissed her account as rural hysteria. Still, something in her tone, measured, calm, entirely unsensational, made her testimony difficult to disregard. Months later, Marr himself traveled to Hawkins County for a mineral survey. His report contains an unexpected admission. The Hollow Creek Formation contains unusual subsoil cavities, natural perhaps, yet symmetrical, as if dug by deliberate hand. Instruments record faint magnetic distortion within these hollows. That statement drew quiet attention from scientific circles, but no funding followed. Marr returned to Charleston and published nothing more on the subject. Within a year he died of heart failure, his unfinished notes sealed with his estate. After her own health declined, Miss Dray withdrew from fieldwork and became reclusive. In her final letter to a colleague, dated 1911, she wrote, "If the ridge truly remembers, it will one day speak again. But I no longer wish to hear it." Her death the following spring marked the last recorded scholarly visit to Hollow Creek for nearly 2 decades. The valley slipped once more into obscurity, the last whispers fading with the old mountain families who remember just enough to be afraid. The story might have finally vanished into dust, if not for the flood of 1913, which tore through several counties along the Appalachian Range. Torrents unearthed long-buried roads, timber roots, and, in some cases, ruins, thought lost forever. When waters receded, travelers reported that the Hollow Creek Trail, obliterated by landslides decades before, had opened again. A local farmer, Jonas Kittrell, was among the first to see it. His written account, discovered years later in his family Bible, recounts, "After the storm, I found the ground ripped clean along the ridge. I could see the old chimney stones plain as day. There was something else, too. Wood, rotten near to dirt, shaped like a door. But it opened to nothing but earth." Kittrell's find drew the attention of the new county marshal, Ephraim Voss, who led a small team to examine the area. They noted the remnants of an interior wall and what appeared to be a hand-dug shaft, roughly 6 feet deep, filled with silt. No artifacts were recovered except for a fragment of brass buckle and several bones, later identified as animal. Still, Voss filed an official notice. Possible burial site, Hollow Creek Settlement. Within weeks of that report, 2 of his deputies resigned. Both cited night disturbances while camped near the ridge, steady tapping sounds as if from below ground. Their resignations went unremarked by state authorities, but in a private letter to his brother, Voss wrote, "The valley breathes, Levi. It exhales mist when the moon is down." By summer's end, the trail was again buried by new slides, sealing whatever the flood had exposed. Curiously, that same year saw renewed discussion of the Maddox case in local newspapers, likely sparked by centennial features about Appalachian folklore. The Nashville Herald ran a small column titled "The Vanished Ridgemen." It summarized the disappearance of the Ray brothers, the mysterious Henry Maddox, and the unverified sightings across state lines. One paragraph quoted an unnamed historian suggesting Maddox may have fled east into North Carolina's highlands, a region already infamous for hermits and deserters after the war. It was here, the article claimed, that strangers matching his likeness were seen trading tools and keeping to themselves. A few readers wrote letters insisting their grandparents remembered such a man, a quiet figure who bartered furs for salt and lived in a dugout cabin. No proof ever surfaced. But for many locals, especially the older generation, the idea that Maddox still roamed was less frightening than the alternative, that he never left at all. By the end of 1913, Hollow Creek was again inaccessible, the trail reclaimed by forest and weather. Yet the newly exposed chimney stones remained visible for years afterward, a small, crooked reminder that the ridge could never quite let go of its secrets. By 1915, Hollow Creek had become a name half remembered and half dreaded, a local caution whispered at hearths but absent from any modern map. The mining companies that expanded through the southern slopes avoided the ridge entirely, calling the ground there unstable and unprofitable. Only one venture, the Sullivan Mineral Survey, ever tried to chart the region. Their chief engineer, Robert Levitt, filed a report that survives in the archives of the Tennessee Geological Office. In it, he wrote, "The Hollow Creek tract shows magnetic irregularities inconsistent with surrounding terrain. The compass wavers and stops altogether near the old foundations. Instruments detect a shallow void, triangular, almost deliberate in shape." Levitt's assistant, Martin Sloan, gave a separate oral statement to county officials, claiming he heard a hum like bees in a jar near the void at dusk. The report was dismissed as nonsense. Within 2 months, Levitt's team abandoned the site after several workers fell ill with fever, their skin marked by a rash they blamed on bad water. But in town, stories spread quickly. Locals revived the name Henry Maddox once more, muttering that the ridge punished those who disturbed its sleep. One woman, Agnes Traylor, told a Knoxville reporter that her grandfather had warned her never to speak his name aloud near running water. "The ground listens through the stream," she said. That same year, a small academic journal printed an article titled "Forgotten Settlements of the Appalachian Interior." Among its citations was a brief note referencing the great Appalachian wilderness and its early maps of uncharted valleys, including an unconfirmed location called Hollow Creek, believed destroyed by erosion or flood. The paper's author, Dr. Edwin Huxley, admitted his sources were inconsistent, drawn from letters and local testimony, yet he closed with an ominous suggestion. It may be that such places do not vanish, but recede, concealed by time and fear in equal measure. Huxley died a year later in an influenza outbreak, but his assistant kept copies of his correspondence. In one letter, Huxley mentioned a woman named Eleanor Dray, the same folklorist who had visited Hollow Creek in 1908. He wrote that she had sent him a parcel of notes before her death, describing voices under frost and the feeling of being observed by the land itself. By 1916, Hollow Creek was once again sealed by landslides after torrential rains. Locals took it as a sign. A newspaper from that winter recorded an old miner's remark: "Every time the ridge breathes out, it takes someone back." For the rest of that decade, few dared to mention it at all. And yet, according to a 1919 county registry, one new homestead was briefly claimed in that very valley by a man listed only as H.M. Carter, occupation, trader. No records show when he left, or if he ever did. The entry for H.M. Carter in the 1919 county ledger might have gone unnoticed were it not for the handwriting. Archivists later compared it to the 1872 Maddox property note found beneath the old cabin floorboards, the slant, the looping M, the inconsistent capital R. The similarity was unnerving. A clerk named Josephine Parr, who processed land claims that year, left a marginal note beside the name. Man seemed older than his years, eyes pale, paid in silver coin from before the war, said he'd be staying up the ridge a while. No taxes were ever collected on that claim. The next entry, in 1920, marked the property as vacant, owner untraceable. Around that same time, the last of the older Hollow Creek families passed away. Their children left for the cities, taking with them little more than fading stories. But in taverns across the region, whispers persisted of a man living alone near the ridge, speaking rarely, seen sometimes at dawn, carrying bundles wrapped in canvas toward the old creek bed. A brief article in the Roane County Courier from August 1920 reported, "Unidentified recluse, calling himself Carter, sought for questioning regarding missing livestock. Cabin found deserted, ashes still warm." The description matched the Maddox property almost exactly. Same foundation stones, same orientation toward the ridge. When deputies arrived, they found strange details. A ledger containing only single-line entries, each dated weeks apart. Rain took them back. Stillness deeper than before. Voices lower now. In the corner of the cabin, a stack of old newspapers from the 1870s had been carefully preserved, their ink faded but intact. Among them, one clipping from the Knoxville Sentinel, the same issue that had first reported the disappearance of the Ray brothers almost 50 years earlier. Deputies burned the papers, claiming they reeked of mold, though witnesses later said they heard crackling like whispers beneath the flames. A later review of the file by historian James Whitmore in 1931 called it the last verifiable trace of Hollow Creek habitation. He wrote that, by that point, the land itself had shifted. Slides, erosion, and root growth had erased any visible sign of structures. Yet when he visited the site, he claimed the compass still faltered near the same clearing, just as Levitt and Marr had described years before. Whitmore's conclusion was restrained but haunting. Whether man or myth, Maddox's story lingers like residue, an unspent charge beneath the soil of Appalachia. The wilderness, vast and indifferent, remembers what it consumes. After that, the ridge fell silent once more. Trains passed miles away, new towns rose and vanished, but the trail that led to Hollow Creek was lost again to undergrowth. Yet even as late as 1922, hikers wrote of hearing faint hammering at dusk where no house had stood for decades. In the early summer of 1922, a small group of forestry students from the University of Tennessee embarked on a survey of reforestation prospects in the northern Appalachians. Their instructor, Professor Leland Crow, divided them into pairs to document tree density and soil composition. One team, Walter Ames and Raymond Bell, was assigned to a low valley between Hawkins and Sullivan counties. The map simply labeled it Creek, unnamed. Their journals, later recovered from the university archives, mention the date June 12th. Reached Lower Valley by sundown. Air unusually still. Compass failed at western end. Found stone remains, possibly foundation. Strange warmth underfoot. Bell's handwriting grew erratic near the end of the entry. Heard someone call my name. Though Ames was ahead, sound came from beneath the ground. The following morning, they found tracks, barefoot, adult-sized, leading down toward a dry stream. Ames noted that the prints stopped abruptly, as though the person stepped into the earth. When they returned to camp, Crow dismissed the claim as mountain nerves. Yet a week later, when reviewing specimens, he found one of Ames's soil samples contained not only shale and clay, but small fragments of decayed fabric. Testing at the time was rudimentary, but the report lists the material as woven cotton, blue dye, mid-19th century. Crow quietly sent the fragment to a historian he knew in Charleston, a surviving colleague of Eleanor Dray. The reply came weeks later, scrawled on aging stationery. Miss Dray spoke often of a blue cloth that clung to a door hook. If what you've found is from that valley, then Hollow Creek has not yet finished its memory. No official expedition followed. The university dismissed the discovery as coincidence. But Crow kept the fragment in a glass case for the rest of his life, labeling it simply Hollow Creek Textile. Meanwhile, locals near the ridge began reporting strange movements, light flickering between trees at night, though no camps were set. A railway worker named Clem Dorset told a tavern crowd in Kingsport that he saw a tall man in an old coat walking the ridge at moonrise, carrying a lantern without flame. Dorset swore he followed him for half a mile before the figure vanished into the fog. Old-timers muttered that Maddox was walking again, searching for those who'd forgotten his name. A traveling preacher later claimed the ridge had opened twice, once to take, once to warn. His congregation dwindled soon after. By autumn of that same year, storms swept through the valley once more, closing the paths for good. The forestry students never returned. Professor Crow retired the following spring, his final lecture ending with a quiet sentence that some of his students never forgot. The mountain keeps its own congregation. The decades that followed turned Hollow Creek from memory into myth. By 1925, most new maps labeled the area as reclaimed woodland, though locals still used the old name with a mix of reverence and unease. In oral retellings, Henry Maddox shifted from man to legend, sometimes a ghost, sometimes a sinner turned to earth. But the remaining county records tell a quieter, stranger truth. In the spring of 1926, a road construction crew working along the northern slopes of the ridge reported finding old timbers and metallic fragments beneath a landslide. The foreman, George Vickers, wrote in his daily log, "The earth gave way under the cart, smelled like damp iron, found what looked like a cellar door under the muck. We shut it and moved on." One worker, Cal Warren, refused to continue. He later told a local paper that when the door was pried up, they saw a chamber only a few feet deep, lined with stacked stones, like a burial vault. He claimed the walls were slick with moisture, but gave off a faint warmth, as if something below was breathing. His foreman dismissed the statement, but Warren quit that same week and left for Knoxville. Officially, the crew reported no findings. The road was rerouted several miles east. That same year, Professor Crow, now retired, received an unsigned envelope containing a folded page torn from a ledger. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate. Rain took them back again. The ridge sleeps easier now. Crow recognized the phrasing instantly. It matched the entries found in the Carter cabin 2 years prior. He turned the paper over and found a faint watermark from a Knoxville stationery shop that had been closed since 1904. He never told the authorities. Instead, he sent the page to the historian James Whitmore, whose earlier report had closed the file on Hollow Creek. Whitmore's response was brief. If the land writes, it does, so through borrowed hands. By 1928, the last reliable witnesses were gone, the old houses along the valleys collapsing into moss and stone. What remained were fragments, letters, field notes, and the occasional whisper from those who ventured too close. One such account came from Ruth Beckett's granddaughter, who told a Works Progress interviewer years later that her grandmother used to hear knocking in the soil after the rain. She said the ground spoke 3 times, once for each man lost to the ridge. The interviewer, a young journalist from Washington, noted her trembling hands as she spoke and later wrote in his margin, "No sound in the room but her pulse." By the dawn of the 1930s, Hollow Creek no longer appeared in any census. But among the older folks who still remembered its name, there lingered an unspoken rule: never light a fire near the ridge after sundown, and never, under any circumstance, answer when the woods call your name. By 1931, the world outside Appalachia was marching into modernity: electric lines, automobiles, paved roads, but in the hollows and ridges, time still pooled in the shadows. The old families that remained along the Tennessee-Virginia border carried their superstitions like heirlooms, and among them, the name Maddox had taken on the weight of a quiet curse. That year, a state archivist named Lillian Pratt began cataloging orphaned county documents lost during courthouse fires. She came across fragments from Hawkins County, mostly land assessments, but between them lay a single page that made her pause. It was the closing sheet of Sheriff Whitley's original 1872 report, thought to have burned decades before. Most of the text was gone, but one sentence survived near the bottom. The Maddox dwelling to remain sealed by order of this office. No excavation permitted. The ridge will keep its silence. The phrasing struck Pratt as unusual. Official reports of that era rarely indulged such tone. She made a note in the margin. Language almost devotional. When she sent the fragment to a colleague at the University of Virginia for preservation, the reply she received contained an odd remark. The conservator wrote that the paper carried a faint metallic residue not typical of ash exposure. The analysis was inconclusive. Later that year, Pratt traveled to Appalachia herself. She described the trip in a private diary, now preserved in the state collection. Her first entry from September reads, "Reached Kingsport by train. Locals speak of Hollow Creek only when pressed. The ridge visible from the inn window appears almost too symmetrical, as if built rather than formed." She hired a guide, Elias Morton, to take her as close to the lost settlement as possible. Morton refused to enter the hollow itself, but agreed to lead her to a nearby rise. From there, she saw the outline of the old clearing, sunlight pooling unnaturally in one spot, as if the ground reflected it. Her last field entry, dated September 14th, is brief and troubling. Heard hammering from below when no one was working. Morton said it was woodpeckers, though none were visible. The sound carried a rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 2. She left the next morning and returned to Richmond. Within months, she resigned her post without explanation. In later correspondence with her sister, she wrote, "It isn't the ghosts that trouble me, it's that the silence there feels earned." After Pratt's resignation, her recovered fragment of Whitley's report was misplaced for nearly 20 years. It resurfaced during a library renovation in the 1950s, found sealed between 2 boards, its ink still legible, as though time itself had chosen not to consume it. But those who handled the page remarked on something subtle, the faint smell of iron, like wet soil after rain. After Lillian Pratt's abrupt departure, few officials dared to revisit her findings. The Great Depression had begun to reshape priorities, and forgotten hollows held little value to anyone but the superstitious. Yet one man, Dr. Samuel Keene, an ethnographer from the University of Chicago, found himself drawn to the legend while studying postbellum isolationist communities. Keene had read fragments of Eleanor Dray's 1908 notes and believed that the Maddox incident might illustrate how trauma and geography entwined in Appalachian memory. In 1933, he traveled south to gather testimonies. His surviving field journal, brittle but intact, records that his local contacts warned him to avoid the ridge after dark. Not for spirits, they said, but for echoes. On his second evening, Keene camped near the perimeter of what maps still called reclaimed woodland. He wrote, "I heard a distinct metallic tapping, thought it perhaps miners working illegally, yet the rhythm was measured, deliberate, like nails driven into wet wood." The next morning, he discovered a single depression in the soil, circular, too neat to be natural, as though something had been lifted out. He filled it with stones before leaving. His final field entry closes with a reference to Reverend Coleman's century-old warning. The mountain does not bury, it remembers. Keene's article, published the following year, attempted to explain the folklore as a collective echo of missing persons cases. He argued that The Maddox story serves as Appalachia's confessional, a way to speak of what the earth refuses to yield. But private letters found after his death tell another story. In one, addressed to a colleague, he wrote, "There is something beneath that valley, something that exhales when disturbed. I fear I heard it answer." Meanwhile, remnants of Hollow Creek began surfacing elsewhere, literally. Heavy spring rains in 1935 triggered a mudslide that revealed timbers from an old structure near Wolf Run, not far from the site Wainwright had surveyed in 1873. Inside the collapsed earth were fragments of pottery, a rusted chain, and what the state coroner described as remains of 2 mules long interred. Among the artifacts, however, was a buckle identical to the one recovered in 1905, engraved faintly with the initials CR. The Ray family, still living in Knoxville, confirmed those initials matched Caleb Ray, one of the missing traders. The discovery reignited old fears. The Knoxville Sentinel, the same paper that had once printed the first story of the vanished brothers, ran a small article titled, "The Ridge Gives Back." But the county office quickly sealed the site, declaring it historically sensitive ground. No further excavation was permitted. And though locals gathered near the ridge to pray, one witness later claimed that each time a hymn began, the echo from the valley below returned it slower, as if sung by something that did not quite remember the words. The rains of 1935 washed away more than just soil. They unearthed a collective unease that lingered through the rest of the decade. Word of the buckle marked CR spread quietly among the families of eastern Tennessee, reviving the old caution not to speak the name Maddox where the wind could carry it. Even the Knoxville Sentinel withdrew its article a week later, printing a short correction. Item of uncertain origin, unverified by state geologist. But copies of the paper survived, folded in trunks and saved by those who understood the hills keep their own kind of truth. By 1937, a civil engineering project planned a series of survey lines through the northern ridges. A young draftsman named Harold Pritchard was assigned to chart elevations near the reclaimed woodland. His surviving field notebook, now at the Appalachian Historical Society, includes a few lines that never made it into the official maps. The soil in Section 14 gives underfoot as though hollow, found embedded iron fixtures, possible remnants of old cellar frame. Crew refused to dig further after dusk. When asked why, one worker told Pritchard, "The earth was whispering like it had breath." Pritchard, trying to maintain composure, wrote a private note to his fiancée that evening. "I'm no man for ghost stories, but the ridge feels awake. The moment a shovel breaks the ground, the wind stops." His crew moved operations 2 miles south, and no more was said. Yet on the following Sunday, the local church service recorded an unusual attendance. Miners, farmers, even railroad men filling the pews, all quiet. When Reverend Daniel Purdy asked for prayer requests, one older woman stood and said, "Pray for the ground to rest." A week later, a flash flood carried more sediment down from the ridge, leaving streaks of red clay through the hollows. Local papers attributed it to iron deposits, but the water and crimson for 3 days. It was during that same month that Professor Crow's last letter was found among his estate papers, written in trembling script and addressed to his former student, Walter Ames, one of the forestry men who had visited Hollow Creek in 1922. It read, "I believe now the soil is not cursed but conditioned. It receives, remembers, and refuses release. Do not let them mine there. The mountain keeps its own census." Crow passed away shortly thereafter. By the end of 1937, the engineering project had been relocated entirely. The new road bypassed the Hollow Creek Valley by nearly 10 miles. No one objected, No one ever officially cited a reason. And so, as the Depression waned and war began to whisper overseas, the ridge returned to its stillness, unchanged, unbothered, yet unmistakably watchful. Locals said the air there grew thick after rain, the scent of iron and pine blending with something colder, older, that reminded them of graves long closed and memories that refused to stay buried. When 1940 arrived, the Hollow Creek Ridge stood almost forgotten again, its legends buried under talk of war and work. Yet that winter, an unexpected discovery drew quiet attention from archivists and historians alike. During a renovation of the Hawkins County Courthouse basement, workers uncovered a sealed crate labeled 1872, unfiled evidence. Inside were damp papers, rusted nails, and a half-rotted leather pouch. Within the pouch lay a single brass locket. It was engraved with the initials E.F., matching Elias Finn, the cousin who had vanished with the Ray brothers. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of 3 men in suspenders standing beside a mule cart. Scribbled on the back in uneven pencil, Hollow Creek, last stop before nightfall. Archivist Clara Hensley, who oversaw the recovery, noted that the pouch was packed with soil still moist despite the decades. She described the smell as earth after storm. When she wrote her report, she added a personal line not typical for archival work. The soil left stains that will not wash from the hands. The discovery revived academic interest briefly. Newspapers framed it as a century-old frontier mystery. The Tennessee Review ran a 3-part article titled "The Ridge That Buried Its Men." The piece cited Dr. Samuel Keene's earlier notes and referenced the great Appalachian wilderness surveys that had charted the region's strange magnetic anomalies. Readers were fascinated for a moment, but fascination faded, as it always did when Hollow Creek's name returned to print. Only one local man, Arthur Maddox, a retired miner from Bristol, claimed kinship with Henry. In a short interview, he stated, "There was a Henry in our line, yes, but he didn't die up there. He just went quiet." When pressed for details, he refused to continue and left the interview mid-sentence. In the same year, government engineers began aerial mapping of eastern Tennessee for potential highway expansion. One image, now housed in the Library of Congress, shows a faint circular depression on the ridge, nearly symmetrical, about 30 yards wide. The surveyors labeled it subterranean collapse. No follow-up inspection ever occurred. Still, the depression aligns precisely with the coordinates of the Maddox homestead recorded in early tax ledgers. A few years later, as war engulfed Europe, the ridge became a footnote again. Yet people living near Wolf Run claimed they still heard tapping on clear winter nights. A blacksmith named Franklin Dyer swore he followed the sound once and found 3 shallow impressions in the snow, evenly spaced, as though made by someone slowly striking the ground from below. He never returned to that spot. By 1942, the last written mention of Hollow Creek in county records appears as a 1-line note on a property ledger. Land unfit. Recommend reforestation. The valley was left to the trees once more, and the trees, so it seemed, were content to keep the silence. By the close of 1945, the war had drawn most of the region's younger men away, and Hollow Creek fell fully silent again. No farms, no fences, only the faint scar of an old road curling into the trees. Yet in the years following the war, a new wave of curiosity stirred among amateur historians and veterans seeking quiet in the hills. One of them, Corporal David Henshaw, kept a diary of his travels through post-war Appalachia. Henshaw's notes, unearthed decades later, describe his December hike up the ridge. The forest was dead quiet, No birds, even in daylight. Found 2 stone outlines, perhaps cabin foundations. Ground soft, gave underfoot like peat. I could smell iron and something older. Couldn't tell if it was decay or rain. On the next page, he wrote a sentence later underlined twice by archivists. Heard a man's voice say my name, though I was alone. The diary ends abruptly 3 pages later with the words, "The ground moved." When Henshaw's family filed a missing person report, local search parties found his knapsack near a dry stream bed, the same one once known as Hollow Creek. Inside were field rations, a compass still spinning erratically, and a folded scrap of paper from an old newspaper. It was the Knoxville Sentinel, 1872 edition, the issue reporting the disappearance of the Ray brothers. No trace of Henshaw himself was ever located. The following year, hikers reported seeing fresh dig marks near the ridge's center, as though someone had recently excavated and filled the soil again. Forestry rangers inspected but found no camp, no tools, only the faint impression of a rectangular pit. The official report closed with the line, "No evidence of human activity." But a ranger named Helen Maris later admitted in a letter to her husband that she'd heard something that day. A muffled knocking, steady, like a heartbeat through dirt. It stopped the moment. I knelt to listen. After her letter was made public, the department ordered that area of the ridge restricted due to unstable ground. It remains so to this day. In 1948, an anonymous envelope arrived at the University of Tennessee Library addressed simply to Archives, Appalachian Studies. Inside was a fragment of paper, brittle and faintly stained. The handwriting matched that of the 1872 Maddox notebook found long ago beneath the floorboards. The ridge sleeps when fed. No sender, no return address, no explanation. By the end of the decade, Hollow Creek had disappeared once more into official silence, its name absent from state maps, its trails erased by landslides, its memory confined to a few trembling pages scattered across history. And still, those who live near the border say that on certain nights, when the fog hangs low and the wind dies, the valley exhales a single breath, long and slow, like something remembering it was once alive. By 1950, only a handful of locals could still recall the name Hollow Creek, and even fewer would speak it aloud. The land had been reclaimed by the forest, an unbroken weave of pine and laurel masking what once had been hearth and field. Yet for a few curious souls, the legend of Henry Maddox refused to rest. That spring, a regional historian named Dr. Margaret Lowell compiled a study on lost settlements of the Appalachian interior. Among the appendices was a section titled The Maddox Disappearances, Unverified Accounts. She referenced the century-old field notes of Thomas Wainwright and Dr. Samuel Keene, as well as the great Appalachian wilderness documentation that had once charted the same ridges. Lowell's tone was measured but unsettled. She observed that every generation had rediscovered Hollow Creek only after some act of nature, flood, storm, or landslide, exposed it anew, as though the earth itself decides when memory is due. Her study never reached print. Her publisher withdrew, citing the unsettling implications of her sources. That summer, a Forestry Service patrol noticed smoke rising briefly from the ridge at dusk, just a thin gray column that vanished before they reached it. They found no campfire, only a ring of wet stones and a small depression where the soil had been freshly turned. Inside the depression lay a single object, a wooden peg with iron nails carved crudely with the letters H.M. The initials, when filed into the district log, were noted with a question mark. The officer who wrote the entry, Deputy Andrew Shaw, added a private remark in pencil. "Thought I heard someone laughing low in the trees. Sounded close, like beside my ear." He requested reassignment 2 weeks later. That autumn, a traveling journalist named Tom Naylor, writing for a rural magazine, visited the area hoping to revive the old story. His piece, The Man Who Natuy, Ver left the ridge, published in 1951, concluded with a haunting line, "If the ridge has a memory, it learned it from Henry Maddox." Readers dismissed it as Gothic embellishment, but Naylor's notebook, recovered after his death, revealed a page torn and stained with what looked like red clay. On it was written, "The ground hums at night, steady like a buried bell." Around this same time, a teacher from nearby Kingsport organized a school trip to study the valley's plant life. The group reported nothing unusual except that the air near the ridge tasted like metal. Photographs taken that day show the children smiling beside the overgrown creek. Yet behind them, faintly visible in the shadows, stands what appears to be a tall, thin figure, a trick of light perhaps, or a tree bent at odd angle. The negative was later examined by state archivists. The image remained inconclusive. Still, when asked years later about that day, one of the former students, by then an old man, told an interviewer softly. The teacher called the roll that evening, but one name echoed back from the ridge before any of us spoke. By 1952, the last trace of Hollow Creek on official records was erased when the State Forestry Service incorporated the ridge into the Appalachian Preservation Zone, a swath of protected wilderness deemed too unstable for development. The survey maps mark the heart of the valley as restricted, unexplored cavities. No further exploration was sanctioned. Yet a few who lived nearby said they still heard things from that sealed place. Loggers working along the southern slope reported faint hammering that echoed from below ground, always in threes, always stopping the moment they turned to listen. Hunters spoke of lantern lights drifting through fog without flame or sound. And once, after a heavy storm in late autumn, a mail carrier found a soaked journal page plastered against his wagon, handwriting old-fashioned, ink blurred but legible. The ridge breathes slow again. The ground is quiet. They are home. No one could explain where it came from, or how paper that fragile had survived a century of rain. That winter, Dr. Margaret Lowell, the historian who had studied the Maddox case, wrote her final essay. Never published, but later found among her estate papers. It ended with this reflection: Appalachia is full of graves, without markers, and stories without ends. Perhaps Henry Maddox was neither murderer nor ghost, but something the mountain invented to remember what it had taken. The silence that follows his name is not absence, it is appetite. In the years that followed, the ridge became a no-man's land, visited only by deer and drifting fog. Locals avoided the path, and even maps began to shift, modern surveys quietly omitting the hollow entirely, as if the earth itself had redacted its own memory. But sometimes, when storms move through the valley, travelers on nearby highways say the rain seems to falter as it passes the old ridge, sound flattening into a hollow. Hush. And if you stop your car, they say, and roll down the window, you might hear it faintly beneath the thunder. 3 taps. Pause. 2. A century has passed since the Ray brothers disappeared, since the earth took back what it was given. Yet in that forgotten fold of the great Appalachian wilderness, where roots twist through iron-red soil, there remains a stillness that feels less like peace and more like listening. And so the story closes where it began, amid the mist and mountains of Appalachia, where men vanish, records fade, and the ridge keeps its silence. Whether the name Henry Maddox belonged to a man or to the land itself, no one can say. But every so often, when the fog curls low and the wind stills, someone walking that border will swear they hear a voice, not shouting, not crying, just calling softly, as if to remind the mountain that it remembers too,